Tonight we are going to wander back in time to a world where your breath freezes in the air before you even notice you are awake, where the sky at dawn is the color of old pewter, and where your hands begin to ache from the cold long before the sun has climbed over the hedgerows. And I'd like you, before we settle in properly, to take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow, sleepy history, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And you can tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now, because somewhere out there, across your own dark window in your own quiet room, someone else is curling up under a blanket and listening to the same story. Now dim the lights if you can. Let whatever device you're using rest comfortably, somewhere you don't have to hold it. Feel the weight of the day sliding off you like snow slipping from a roof, and picture yourself breathing mist into a frozen dawn in medieval England, in a winter around the year 1250, when there were no radiators, no double glazing, no thick duvets or central heating, only the thin barrier of whatever shelter human hands could wrestle out of mud, straw, timber, smoke, and sheer stubborn will. You wake to the sound of a crow, calling above a field rimmed in silver, the kind of sound that seems to crack the sky open for a moment before it falls back into silence, and the first thing you are truly aware of is the cold creeping against your skin, not as a sharp stab, but as a slow, deliberate presence, seeping through every thread of the rough wool blanket that covers you. The roof above you is thatched and patched and blackened with smoke, and as your eyes adjust to the dim orange glow of embers under ash, you can almost hear the quiet creak of frost tightening its grip on the old timbers, the tiny brittle crackle of ice forming in the gaps where wind and weather always find a way in. Somewhere beyond your wall of earth and stick and hope, a narrow stream lies under a thin milky crust of ice, and the fields beyond the village are hard as iron, the furrows frozen so stiff that even the plough would rasp uselessly across their backs. Before stone cottages and neat chimneys and carefully laid floors, most people in medieval England lived in shelters that were more like stubborn experiments than finished homes, structures raised in a hurry against the oncoming season, built not from architectural drawings or careful calculations, but from whatever lay to hand: earth, straw, branches, the dung of animals, a few precious beams of wood, the memory of how last year's walls managed to stay up, and the quiet fear that this year's might not. When you press your hand against the nearest wall, it is not smooth or solid like modern brick. It is cold and faintly damp, and you can feel under your fingers the uneven texture of wattle and daub, the braided lattice of thin rods underneath, and the dried skin of mud and straw and dung that has been pressed into it, patched, cracked, and smeared over again, year after year, as if the house itself were a living creature whose wounds must be tended each winter. The floor is not really a floor at all, just packed earth pressed hard by countless bare feet, scattered with old rushes that rustle softly when you move, still holding a faint, ghostly scent of last summer's riverbanks and meadow edges, and as you shift your weight you can feel the cold rising from the ground, like a second kind of air, lapping slowly at your ankles and knees. Historians talk about these houses in careful terms: sunken featured buildings, half dug into the earth, pit houses, sometimes just shallow hollows roofed over with timber and thatch, but from where you sit, shivering in the dim light, they feel less like examples in a book and more like burrows, like the desperate attempt of a fragile animal to crawl into the body of the land itself and hide there until the killing weather passes. You pull your cloak around you and step closer to the hearth, which is nothing more than a shallow scoop in the earth, lined with stones that have turned black and glossy with smoke, and you watch as a few remaining embers pulse gently under their blanket of ash, like weak little hearts refusing to go out. There is no chimney yet, no neat stone throat to guide the smoke. It simply curls upward into the low, smoky air, searching lazily for the small hole cut into the thatch above, and much of it never finds its way out at all. It gathers along the rafters, hangs in a dim blue-grey veil across the room, stings your eyes and catches in your throat, but it also does something quieter and more mysterious. It dries the timbers, chases away insects, kills mold and lice and tiny hidden life that would otherwise eat the house from within. The very thing that makes you cough is also, in its own slow way, preserving the fragile skin of your shelter. Around you in the thick shadowy air, there are no glass windows to open and close, no bright panes greeting the morning light. At best there might be a shutter of rough planks or a small gap where horn or parchment could one day be stretched to let in a washed-out glow. For now the light is mostly firelight, soft and flickering, carving the room into slices of gold and deep shadow. You can make out a low bench here, a rough stool there, a few tools hanging from pegs hammered into the wattle, a wooden spoon darkened by years of stew, a clay pot with a chipped lip, a loop of dried herbs tied in a knot near the door, half charms, half medicine. Everything simple, everything used, everything necessary. As the morning seeps in, grey and reluctant, you push aside the curtain that serves as a door and step out onto the village green, your boots cracking the thin crust of ice that has formed over last night's mud. The air outside is sharper now, slicing at the inside of your nostrils, and the sight that greets you is not one of sturdy stone cottages lined up in respectable order, but of a scattered cluster of huts that look as if they have grown out of the ground, their walls swelling and sagging, their roofs leaning into one another, straw weighted by frost so that they resemble old tired animals huddling together for warmth. Most of these walls have been raised from the same things your own shelter is made of, earth scraped from the fields mixed with water and straw and dung, and sometimes whisper the old stories, even with animal blood, to make the whole mass bind more firmly. You imagine a man standing ankle-deep in mud on a cold day, hands red and raw, stirring this heavy mixture as if it were bread dough, lifting it in great clumps and slapping it onto the woven panels of wattle, pressing it in with his palms until the gaps vanish, and the surface becomes one uneven, glistening skin, waiting to dry into dull, cracked safety. Perhaps his children, bored and shivering, press their hands into the soft surface and laugh, leaving behind tiny handprints that will linger inside the wall for centuries, long after their names and faces are gone. Cob, some later builders will call it, as they pile it thicker and higher, turning mud and straw into walls several feet deep, walls that hold warmth the way a clay pot holds water, cool to the touch but strangely patient, storing the slow heat of fires day after day and releasing it back into the room long after the flames have died. But here, in this early moment, you don't know that word, and you don't think of building as a craft with rules and measures. For you it is simply survival, a repeating rhythm of scraping, lifting, pressing, patching, of watching the sky, and gauging how much time you have before the next hard frost will crack everything that has not yet dried. Walk a little farther, and you can feel the ground itself changing beneath your boots. Here, where last year's fires melted the snow, it is softer, a churned mess of ash and mud. There, in a corner where no one passes, it is stiff and glassy, frozen into a pale crust. You pass a hut that is partly sunk into the earth, its doorway set low so that the roof barely rises above the surrounding soil. To step into it, you would have to duck and shuffle downward, and inside the air would feel different, heavier, more still, as if the whole room were a cupped hand trying to protect a fragile flame. The earth, piled up against the walls from outside, does what stone and brick have not yet learned to do for most people. It shelters, it holds back the wind, muffles the shriek of the storm, gives you a sense that you are cocooned in the side of a sleeping hill. Yet if the thaw comes too fast, if the snow melts and the rain follows, that same house will weep water through its floor, turning your refuge into a damp, sucking pit. The day moves slowly forward, and with Elliot the faint, habitual rhythm of a village that has no choice but to keep building. Someone hauls a new bundle of reeds to reinforce a sagging roof. Someone else, old and stooped, stands with a wooden paddle in hand, smoothing fresh daub over a crack in the wall, tapping rhythmically, as if the house were a drum and he is coaxing it back into tune. Children gather armfuls of dry straw and broken sticks, not because they are playing, but because every scrap of fuel might mean another hour of warmth once the sun sinks away. By the time you return to your own little hut, the sky has turned the colour of unpolished pewter again, and the first thin flakes of snow drift sideways in the wind, not yet serious, but full of promise. Inside, the air smells of smoke and damp wool and earth, that deep, quiet scent that is both unpleasant and comforting, like an animal's den. You kneel beside the hearth and coax the embers back to life, adding a few twigs, then a thicker branch as the flames begin to lick lazily around the wood. Orange light reaches up and touches the underside of the thatch, where thick smoke curls and swirls, dark and slow. You gather close to that small circle of warmth because, in truth, it is the only thing standing between you and the vast, indifferent cold pressing from all sides. Not just the cold in the air, but the cold locked into the soil, the cold in the stones, the cold in the long dark hours still to come. Around the fire, shoulders lean into shoulders, and hands wrap around bowls, not to eat quickly and rush away, but to rest for a moment in the comfort that something is warm and solid and real. As the night stretches its weight across the village, the wind begins its slow, insistent probing at the edges of every house, a thin, eerie sound as it slides through the smallest cracks in the wattle, a ghost pushing its fingers through the walls, testing, always testing. Above you, the thatch whispers softly, shifting under the touch of snow and air, and you lie down again on your rough bedding, pulling cloak and blanket and stray scraps of cloth over yourself in layers, becoming, as someone centuries later will joke, like an onion wrapped for winter. Your breath rises in little clouds and disappears almost at once into the smoky darkness. In that half-sleeping, half-waking state where the mind loosens its grip on the day, you begin to sense something else at work here. Deeper than the ache in your fingers and the sting in your throat, the slow, stubborn ingenuity of people who refuse to lie down in the snow and let winter have them. The idea that walls can be thickened, that earth can be shaped, that a house can be patched and repatched, that the same mud that clings coldly to your boots can also, when mixed and dried and tended, hold your warmth close to you for just a little longer. You drift towards sleep, with the sound of the fire sighing beside you, the quiet breathing of others in the dark, and the faint, steady creak of your fragile little shelter, adjusting itself to the cold. It is not safe, not really, and it is not comfortable by any modern measure, but for tonight it is enough. Tonight, the walls of earth and straw and smoke stand between you and the frost, and in this small flickering circle of warmth, carved out of the endless winter, your story, and the long, patient story of how people in medieval England learned to build shelter at all, has only just begun. When you step outside again, the cold is sharper, more alert, as though the entire landscape has been waiting for you to emerge. And the moment your boots touch the half-frozen mud, the wind rises just enough to remind you that winter in medieval England is not a season so much as a presence, something that presses against your ribs and your thoughts, something you learn to live alongside, in the same way you learn to live with an animal that shares your shelter, wary, patient, always aware of its mood. The path between the huts is slick with frost, each footprint glowing faintly in the pale morning light, as though the ground itself still remembers the heat of the person who walked there before you. And as you follow the curve of the village green, you begin to understand something quiet and humbling about this world. Shelter was not a finished thing, but an ongoing negotiation with the weather. Men and women did not build a house once, admire it, and leave it to stand proudly through the decades. Instead, they patched, daubed, scraped, stuffed, smoothed and repaired the walls every season, because the freeze would crack them, and the thaw would soften them, and the wind would find new gaps to sneak through, and in a way the building lived and breathed and aged exactly as the people inside it did, always one bad storm away from falling apart, always one mindful hand away from lasting another year. You stop beside a half-collapsed wall, where someone has woven flexible hazel rods into a rough but rhythmic pattern, each rod bending patiently around the upright stakes, as though the tree remembers how to move even after being cut, and you run your fingers along the surface, feeling the grooves and ridges of the wood under the half-dry daub. This is the skeleton of the shelter, simple, clever, and utterly ancient, woven branches that behave like ribs, holding the mud in place, allowing the structure not to resist the wind but to yield with it, to sway ever so slightly when the gale hits, the same way a willow bends instead of breaking. Builders did not speak of flexibility or load distribution or tensile strength. They simply learned, through generations of watching storms tear their work apart, that houses built like trees survived storm after storm, while stiff and stubborn ones cracked like brittle bones. When you lean closer, you catch the faint scent of clay and straw, the cold memory of last summer trapped in the dried stalks, and there is something deeply soothing about the simplicity of it all. Nothing is wasted, nothing is too humble to be useful, and the very things that cling under your boots as you walk are the things that hold back the winter at night. A woman nearby lifts a basket of wet earth mixed with crushed straw and lays it gently onto the wattle wall, pressing it in with her palms, smoothing it with careful, practiced strokes, her fingers leaving faint lines that will likely remain visible long after she is gone. Her breath fogs in the air, curling around her face, and for a moment the only sounds are the quiet squelch of mud and the soft creaking of the woven rods beneath her touch. Children gather around her, kneeling in the frozen dirt, helping in the only ways they know how. One brings handfuls of straw, another carries a small wooden pot of water, and the youngest presses her tiny palm into a patch of soft daub, giggling as she leaves a perfect imprint on the wall. The mother does not scold her. Instead, she smiles a weary smile, perhaps knowing that those handprints will dry and remain there for years, maybe decades, a quiet, accidental reminder that shelter here is always built by more hands than one. Archaeologists centuries later will find marks like these, tiny fingers, childish smudges, accidental signatures of families who never wrote their names, and wonder what stories were held in those walls. As the sun rises a little higher, turning the frost on the thatched roofs into a lace of white gold, you hear the rhythmic scrape of an adze somewhere behind the huts. A man is shaping a timber beam, each stroke releasing curls of pale wood that fall to the ground like feathers. The smell is fresh and sharp, almost sweet, and as he works you can sense the reverence in every movement. Timber is life here. It is roof and frame and fire and hope, and each piece is chosen with care, because every mistake weakens the house, and every weakness invites the cold inside. The carpenter squints at the beam, testing its weight, running his thumb along the clean edge he has just carved, and when the light hits it just right, you notice a small symbol scratched into the wood, not decorative, not random, but a mark of ownership or pride, perhaps a secret little signature that only other craftsmen would understand. Medieval carpenters often left these tucked into hidden corners of beams, unseen by the families who lived beneath them, but unmistakable reminders of the hands that shaped the house and the long chain of knowledge that allowed those hands to work. A group of men gather around the carpenter now, lifting the finished beam and carrying it toward a half-raised frame near the edge of the village. They move in unison, boots sliding carefully on the frozen ground, and the sound they make, heavy breathing, the low grunt of effort, the thud of wood against wood as the beam is set into place, becomes part of the steady winter rhythm that holds the village together. And as you watch them work, you begin to understand that shelter in medieval England was not just a structure, but a partnership between people and earth, between families and neighbours, between the living forest and the hands that harvested it. Every beam reused, every patch of daub smoothed, every twig woven into the wattle was an act of faith that warmth could be pulled from the cold world, that a barrier could be raised between life and the season that tried relentlessly to erase it. By midday, smoke rises from half the huts, curling in soft ribbons above the thatched roofs, and the air smells of burning oak and damp straw and frost melting against warm clay. You stand there for a long moment, letting that scent wrap around you, letting the weak winter sun rest on your skin, feeling as if the entire village is inhaling and exhaling in a single slow breath. For a moment you forget the cold. For a moment you understand why these fragile walls have stood for generations. The cold settles differently, as the afternoon drifts toward evening, not harsher, not gentler, just deeper, as though the winter air has begun to sink into the very shape of the land, filling every hollow and every breath. And when you walk toward the edge of the village where the new house is being raised, you can feel the difference beneath your boots. The frost is thicker here, more brittle, and the thin glaze of ice cracks in long, delicate lines with every step you take. The smell of fresh-cut oak still lingers in the air, mingling with the sharper scent of cold bark, and from a distance the half-built frame looks like the ribcage of some great animal settling slowly into the earth. Each beam a bone, each joint a memory of the forest it once belonged to. The men stand in a loose circle around the rising structure, their breaths drifting upward in pale clouds that hang for a moment before dissolving into the stillness. And for a time no one speaks. They simply listen to the whisper of the wind moving through the beams, testing the frame in its own quiet way. It is a strange thing, almost sacred. This moment before the house becomes a house, when the timbers have been shaped and fitted, but not yet bound to their purpose, when the structure feels alive but waiting, as though inhaling before taking its first breath. One of the older carpenters steps forward and runs his hand over a mortise joint, feeling the precision of the cut, the smoothness where the adze has bitten cleanly, and his fingertips linger there as if he can judge not only the wood's strength but also its temperament, whether it will hold through storms or warp under rain, whether it will groan gently or crack under pressure. He nods once slowly, and the others move closer, lifting new beams into place with the heavy, silent cooperation of people who have done this more winters than they can count. As they lift the long crossbeam toward its resting point, you notice the small rituals that accompany the work, the way one man touches the wood with a quiet murmur before the final push, the way another steps back to look at the alignment 3, 4, 5 times, squinting against the pale light, the way everyone falls into the same rhythm without needing to speak. These are not superstitions, not really. They are habits shaped by fear and respect, the understanding that a house built carelessly is not a house at all, but a trap waiting to fail when the first heavy snow arrives. The beam settles into its joint with a deep, satisfying sound, a kind of wooden sigh that seems to ripple through the frame, and for a moment the entire structure vibrates faintly, alive with the energy of the people who raised it. Someone drives a wooden peg into the join, striking it with slow, deliberate blows, each one sending a dull echo through the frozen air. The peg holds, the joint tightens, and the frame adjusts its weight like a living thing taking its first steady step. Work continues in slow, patient movements. Another beam shaped, another peg cut, another joint tested with a craftsman's practiced eye, and the pile of pale shavings at the carpenter's feet grows deeper, a soft bed of curls and feathers that steam faintly where the sun touches them. Children gather these shavings later to use as kindling, picking them up in cold, cupped hands, as though gathering the cast-off warmth of the day. You stand a while longer, watching as the skeleton of the house becomes more certain, its angles sharper, its lines cleaner, the shape of its future rooms beginning to whisper themselves into the cold air. The wind threads through the beams with a low hum, almost musical, and the carpenter pauses, listening the way a shepherd listens for a change in his flock. He taps one support with the flat of his hand, then another, checking for resonance and strength, and nods again, not triumphantly, just quietly, the nod of a man who knows his work will stand long enough to matter. And it will stand, not for centuries perhaps, but for seasons, for storms, for births and winters and long evenings by the fire. That is the promise he builds into the wood, not permanence but endurance, not grandeur, but survival. In a small moment of stillness, one of the younger men steps into the doorway and frames himself there, looking out at the village as though imagining the years ahead, smoke curling gently from the hearth, laughter echoing in the rafters, children tumbling across the packed earth floor, and for a moment he smiles, a brief, soft curve that warms the air more than the sun has all day. Behind him, the timbers glow faintly, catching the last thin ribbon of light that slips through the clouds, and the whole structure seems to breathe. As dusk begins to settle, the men gather their tools, chisels, mallets, augers, adzes, worn smooth by hands and years, and wrap them in cloth before heading back along the narrow frosted path toward the center of the village. The frame stands quietly behind them, its silhouette dark against the pale sky, a promise of warmth where now there is only cold air and expectation. In the distance, the first hearth smoke of evening rises from the nearest hut, drifting in thin silver strands and melting into the twilight. You follow the men back slowly, inhaling the last traces of fresh oak and cold earth, and feel something shift inside you, not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth, the knowledge that even in the hardest winter there are hands shaping the world against the cold, bending the stubbornness of nature into shelter. Night falls gently over the village, pressing its soft weight onto the roofs and walls, and as you approach your own dimly lit doorway, the half-finished house behind you stands steady and silent, holding its place against the wind, ready to become a home. The first snow of evening comes softly, drifting in slow spirals that seem almost hesitant, as though the sky is feeling its way into darkness, grain by grain, and by the time you step back out of your hut, the roofs of the village have already begun to change shape, their golden thatch now coated in a pale, uneven white that softens every line and turns each cottage into a small sleeping creature, curled against the cold. You walk toward one of the newly rethatched roofs, and run your hand along the edge of the straw waiting in a tidy bundle by the wall. It squeaks faintly under your fingers, the sound dry and crisp, and each stalk is long, clean, and chosen with an almost obsessive precision. Roofs like these are not built in haste. Every reed has to be cut at just the right season, bundled tightly, dried properly, and layered in a way that lets water slide rather than sink. Thatching is both science and superstition, and the man who climbs the ladder now, his hands cracked and reddened by the cold, knows that each knot he ties and each bundle he positions will decide whether this home breathes warmth or inhales frost. The thatcher moves with a strange, assured grace, balancing on the steep pitch like a bird perched on a branch, tapping each yelm into place with a flat wooden paddle, the rhythmic sound carrying across the frozen village. Tap, tap, a kind of winter heartbeat. Snowflakes cling to his hair and shoulders, melting instantly where the heat of his body still lingers, and for a moment he pauses, listening to the wind, adjusting his stance, judging the angle of the next bundle of straw with nothing more than instinct, and years of remembering what roofs look like after storms. The air beneath the eaves hums softly as the first lines of new thatch settle into position. You lean against the wall and notice how tightly packed the straw ends are, how no matter how closely you look, the gaps between them are almost invisible. That tightness is life. A loose roof is a death sentence. A well-laid thatch can last 20 or 30 years, but a bad one might leak the first night, soaking the bedding, chilling the infant in the corner, making the hearth hiss and sputter until smoke creeps into every breath. In medieval England, comfort and misery often hinged on how well a single craftsman did his job. There is a superstition associated with this work, and you see it now as the thatcher pauses near the ridge. A fat little spider crawls lazily across the straw, weaving a small thread between the stalks. The man doesn't brush it away. Instead, he nods slightly, almost respectfully. Spiders are good luck here. Their webs help bind the straw, or so people believe, and knocking one down invites rain into the roof. So the spider stays, and the roof keeps its quiet guardian. You climb the small ladder for a closer look and peer beneath the thatch, seeing the chaotic, beautiful maze of twigs, straw ends and woven reeds packed so tightly that only the thinnest sliver of light pushes through. It is a world of tiny shadows, still and dense, and for a moment you imagine what it must be like inside your own roof. Dark, warm, full of smoke-soaked memories. The smell of straw is sweet, faintly reminding you of fields in August, as if summer itself is stitched into the rooftop, a charm against the winter nights. The thatcher ties the last bundle with willow cord, pulling the knots tight with a grunt that echoes faintly in the cold air. His hands are stiff now, reddened almost purple, but he continues with the same calm precision, smoothing the layers with his paddle, checking the slope to ensure that water will run cleanly off. A steep roof is safest. Rain must not linger. Snow must slip away before its weight crushes the ribs of the house beneath. Archaeologists centuries later will measure the angles of these old roofs and note how those in the north are sharper, more daring, more expressive of the fight against heavy rain and deep snow, while those in the south are broad and thick, sheltering against endless drizzle rather than blizzards. A faint breeze kicks up and snow shakes loose from the higher huts, sliding in thin sheets that hiss softly as they land. You tilt your face upward. The flakes melt quickly on your skin, cold for only a breath before becoming nothing at all. For a moment everything feels suspended, the air, the sound, even time itself, as though the village is holding still while the roof above you breathes out a long whispered sigh. It is then you notice a small bundle tied beneath the highest point of the thatch, nearly invisible in the twilight. A charm, perhaps, made of rushes woven in a circle, a custom some villagers quietly maintain. A house is finished not when the last yelm is placed, but when a blessing is hidden within the roof, a silent little promise that storms will pass gently, that the home beneath will be spared. Whether it works or not is irrelevant. Belief warms people the way fire cannot. As the light fades, the thatcher descends the ladder. Wiping his hands on his cloak, he glances upward once more, checking the slope, the tightness of the cords, the way the fresh thatch glows faintly gold under the dimming sky. Then he nods, the same quiet gesture craftsmen have made for centuries, and steps away. The roof will hold. You step inside the hut, and instantly feel the difference. The sound of wind is softer now, muffled by the new layers. Drops of melted snow slide harmlessly down the outer slope instead of dripping onto the floor. The air feels thicker, warmer, almost tender in its stillness. The straw overhead carries the day's last warmth in its fibres, and as you sit by the hearth you realize that shelter here is not a wall, not a roof, not a floor. It is 1,000 small choices layered carefully over one another until the cold must fight its way through. Outside, snow continues to fall in delicate spirals, settling gently on the fresh golden thatch, and the roof above you exhales the warmth it has gathered, a steady, living thing in the heart of a frozen world. The next morning arrives the way winter mornings always do in medieval England, quietly, reluctantly, as though the sun has to be persuaded to climb above the horizon at all, its pale light filtering through the smoke hole overhead like a thin ribbon of tired gold. You open your eyes to the faint glow of embers, breathing under a crust of greying ash, the soft hum of a fire that never truly slept, and for a moment you lie still, listening to the fragile rhythm of your home, holding on to the last traces of warmth it gathered through the night. The hearth is small, barely more than a shallow pit, lined with stones darkened and polished by years of flame, and yet it is the true heart of the house, not the walls that keep the wind out, nor the roof that sheds the rain, but this circle of glowing red that draws every human and animal presence toward it, like a slow, ancient magnet. Without fire there is no light, no warmth, no soft place for breath to linger, no way to dry wet boots or boil water, or keep the winter sickness at bay. Without fire there is no home. You kneel before the pit and stir the ashes with a stick, watching the embers pulse brighter, like a creature waking under your touch. A faint thread of smoke rises toward the roof hole, curling around the beams, thickening the air until it tastes slightly bitter on your tongue. There is no chimney yet, a luxury reserved for the wealthy or the very fortunate, so the smoke does what smoke has always done here. It rises slowly, stubbornly, filling the house like water fills a bowl, drifting against the low roof until it slips out through the one deliberate gap left above the flames. And though it stings your eyes and settles into your clothes and clings to your skin, it also dries the rafters, warms the beams, and kills the insects that would otherwise nest above you. Smoke in this place and time is both a curse and a guardian. You cough because of it, and you survive because of it. The fire has eaten the last of last night's wood, leaving only tired embers behind, so you place a few small twigs on top, then a larger piece of oak, and watch as the wood catches slowly, reluctantly, sending sparks skipping upward like tiny orange insects fleeing the cold. The room shifts with the new warmth, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the gentle, steady reassurance of heat remembering its purpose. As you warm your hands over the fire, palms tingling with returning blood, your thoughts drift to something recorded in old manor accounts and parish writings. The hearth was never allowed to go out completely. Letting it die was not merely inconvenient. It was a sign of misfortune, a whisper of bad luck, an omen people took seriously. If the fire stumbled into darkness, someone would hurry to a neighbor's house to borrow a live coal, cupping it carefully in a clay pot insulated with moss, a tiny heart of warmth carried through frozen streets like a ritual offering. You imagine that now, a single dull red coal traveling across the village beneath the stars, carried in trembling hands, the promise of heat passing from one home to another. Fire, in winter, was not shared lightly. It was both precious and sacred. You rise and look around the room as the light gently expands. Soot streaks the walls like ghostly fingers reaching upward. Rushes lie scattered across the floor, half crushed, their faint herbal scent releasing into the warm air, rosemary perhaps, or mint, or sweet meadow grass gathered in the last days of summer, specifically to make this season just a little gentler. A single iron pot hangs over the fire, its sides blackened and shining, the metal warm beneath your touch. This pot will feed the family, boil water, steep herbs, and warm the room more than all the blankets put together. Outside you hear the muted sounds of the village, a rooster crowing politely into the freezing air, someone chopping wood with careful strokes, a goat bleating from the animal shelter as steam rises from its breath. Most families still sleep near their hearths, bodies curled beneath coarse blankets, their forms faintly outlined by the faint glow of the fire. A child rolls over in the corner, rustling the straw, and a dog lifts its head briefly before settling again, tail twitching in a dream. And somewhere, far away yet strangely close, the wind shifts and presses against the door, the wood groaning softly, as though testing whether the house is awake too. You sit again by the fire and add another piece of wood. Flames lick at it slowly, casting long orange fingers across the walls, bringing the room back into a world of shadow and glow. This mixture of light and darkness is the natural state of medieval winter, not pure brightness, not pure night, but a flickering balance that hums gently inside the bones. There is a story found in one 14th century chronicle of a village suffering through a terrible freeze. The cold was so relentless that every hearthstone cracked, every roof stiffened, every breath felt like swallowing knives. In desperation, the villagers dragged all their fires into the middle of the green, building one huge communal hearth, and slept around it. Dozens of them, faces lit by the enormous flame, arms and cloaks touching, the warmth shared by everyone, no walls dividing them, no class or rank, only the common need to feel heat in their fingertips. Whether that story is true or embellished by time is impossible to know, but the image endures, a reminder that in winter fire is not just flame but community. The hearth before you snaps softly, sending a brief fountain of sparks toward the smoke hole. They rise in a spiral, bright for a heartbeat, then fade into the dark. The fire is breathing again. The house feels alive. You lean back, eyes heavy, warmed by the gentle thrum of heat against your skin, and listen as the world settles into the first proper rhythm of morning. People stirring, animals shifting, the wind humming against the thatch, the fire crackling in small, sleepy bursts. Every sound blends together into a kind of winter lullaby, and the warmth touches your face like a soft hand. It occurs to you then that this, more than anything else, is how medieval people survived the cold, not with perfect walls or perfect roofs, but with persistence, with patience, with vigilant tending of the fire, with breath, warming breath in the dim smoky air, with each day beginning at the hearth, and returning to it again no matter what waited outside. The flames rise a little higher now, steady and sure, and the room brightens. You wrap your cloak around your shoulders, feeling the wool soften under the new heat, and know that this small circle of light will follow you through the day. Outside, the world is still frozen. Inside, the hearth holds the line. Before dawn has fully settled into morning, you feel the cold creeping through the cracks again, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, deliberate presence, the kind that finds its way beneath doors and between timbers, exploring the room inch by inch, until even the warmest corner feels touched by winter. You sit up, pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders, and as your eyes adjust to the dimming glow of the fire, you notice the faint silver sheen on the floor, where frost has begun to gather along the edges of the room, delicate as lace, glittering with a cold that feels almost intelligent in the way it seeks out the softest points of the house. The floor beneath you is not wooden, nor tiled, nor anything carved or polished. It is earth, pressed hard by years of footsteps, flattened by the work of countless seasons, and covered with a thin scattering of rushes that rustle softly when you shift your weight. These rushes are not random. They were gathered from riverbanks in warmer months, dried in the sun, and mixed with herbs like chamomile, lavender, or sweet flag to mask the heavier smells of winter. With each step you take, the scent rises faintly, a subtle reminder of summer hidden inside the frozen heart of the year. But beneath those rushes lies the truth of medieval living, cold that climbs, cold that moves upward through the soil like a ghost refusing to be buried, cold that makes the floor as much an enemy as the wind outside. The earth does not care who walks upon it. It holds the night's chill with perfect indifference. You push the door shut again. It groans in protest, swollen from damp, and wedge a small flat stone at its base to keep the draught from squeezing through. Medieval accounts speak often of these doorways, how the timbers warped in winter, shrinking or swelling until a perfect seal was impossible, and so the wind always found a way inside. People stuffed the gaps with sheep's wool or moss soaked in animal fat, an improvised insulation that hardened as it dried and kept the worst of the cold out. You crouch now and test the packed moss with a fingertip. It feels springy and dense, smelling faintly of the forest, a tiny remnant of warmer, greener days. It is almost astonishing how much warmth such small, simple acts can preserve. The stuffing of a crack, the layering of rushes, the hanging of a heavy cloth over a wall. You look toward the far side of the room, where a rough woven mat has been hung along the wall. The edges flutter with each small draught, and the fabric is stiff from smoke and frost. But this single piece of cloth changes the entire space. Beneath it, the wall is warmer, the cold less intrusive. In richer homes, tapestries would fill this role, thick woolen hangings embroidered with saints or hunts or battles. But here, in a peasant cottage, even an old patched cloak becomes insulation. It is not beautiful, but it works. Archaeologists have found the tiny wooden pegs that once held these fabrics in place, still embedded in old timbers centuries later, reminders that people understood warmth, not with scientific language but with instinct and intimacy. They learned which corners the wind loved to pry open, which cracks hummed on stormy nights, which parts of the wall needed thickening with fresh daub each season. Their houses were imperfect, but alive. The fire beside you sputters, sending a thin ribbon of smoke curling across the floor in a ghostly dance before rising toward the darkness overhead. You add a small handful of twigs, then a thicker log, and watch as the flames gather themselves again, pushing back the shadows a little. The heat radiates outward slowly, warming your face and hands before reaching your feet, and you can feel where the warmth stops, a faint invisible circle where comfort ends and winter begins once more. Behind you, from the far corner of the cottage, you hear the low shifting sound of animals stirring. A goat shuffles closer to the warmth, its breath steaming in the cold air, and you can hear the soft snort of a pig, nestled in its straw bed behind the partition. Their warmth fills the room as much as the fire does, a steady, living heat breathing softly in the dimness. You move toward the wall again, and press your palm against it. The cold is there, yes, but not the biting, merciless cold of the outdoors. This cold is muted by the layers of mud, straw, and old repairs. The wall feels solid yet strangely soft, like something built by hand rather than machine. Lines of dried daub form small waves where the mixture was pressed into gaps during previous winters. You can see fingerprints, actual fingerprints, preserved in the dried clay, left by the hands of someone who lived here long before. It is hard not to wonder who they were. A tired father working quickly before a storm, a mother smoothing the wall while her children gathered straw, a child pressing curious fingers into wet mud, giggling as the impression remained. Walls in this world are not anonymous. They remember, and beside the wall, on the floor, in the fading glow of the fire, the frost melts slowly where the warmth reaches it, turning silver crystals to droplets that darken the earth before disappearing entirely. You kneel and run your hand along the uneven floor, feeling the contrast, cold biting at the edges, warmth pulsing near the hearth. It becomes clear then that a medieval house is not just built, it is defended, not with perfect architecture, but with vigilance, daily maintenance, and an intimate understanding of how the cold behaves. Some medieval texts mention an old saying, "The cold will find the hole you forgot," and you realize how true it is. You sit back by the fire, tucking your cloak around your legs, and listen to the sigh of the wind outside, the soft murmur of animals, the faint drip of melting frost, the small popping sounds of the burning wood. Everything in the room, walls, floor, roof, fire, animals, breath, works together, a fragile alliance against a world that would freeze everything still if given the chance. As the fire grows stronger, the space around you brightens in a soft amber glow, warming your cheeks and fingertips. Someone stirs behind you, a child perhaps, shifting beneath a blanket and whispering softly before drifting back into sleep. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep in, feeling the house breathe around you, its walls hushing the wind, its roof settling with a faint creak, its floor warming grain by grain beneath your feet. And in that stillness you understand something profound. Survival here is not a victory over winter, but a quiet collaboration with whatever small warmth you can gather and keep. The day drifts forward slowly, as winter days always do, with the sun rising, not in a burst of gold, but in a pale, hesitant shimmer that struggles to push its way through the thick grey of the sky. And as the fire warms the room in soft, patient waves, you notice how the light enters your home, not through glass, not through a clear pane that offers a crisp view of the world outside, but through something far older, far dimmer, and far more fragile. The window is little more than a narrow opening in the wall, covered not with glass but with a sheet of scraped animal horn, stretched and thinned until it becomes faintly translucent. When you approach it, the horn glows softly, a blurred patch of gold where the sun presses itself against the surface. You can see shadows move across it, the shape of a passing chicken, the flick of a goat's ear, the shifting silhouette of someone carrying firewood, but no details, only the language of light and shadow, soft and vague. It is strange in a way how comforting that dimness becomes. The outside world feels close, but not intrusive, familiar but softened, present but gentle. Glass windows will come centuries later for ordinary people, but for now, horn is enough, It lets in light but keeps out rain, wind, and the sharp teeth of winter. You run your fingertips along the edge of the window frame. The wood is rough, worn smooth in places where hands have touched it over the years, and at the base a thin line of frost has gathered, delicate as lace, melting where your skin brushes it. You lean closer, pressing your palm lightly against the horn. It is cool, faintly greasy, and slightly uneven, like a living thing. When the wind rises, the horn flexes ever so slightly, bowing inward, then outward, responding to the breath of the world outside. In wealthier homes, oiled parchment might take the place of horn, stretched tightly across wooden frames to let in a little more light. But here, in this small cottage, horn is precious, the leftover gift of an animal whose meat fed the family, whose hide was tanned, whose bones became tools. Nothing wasted, everything transformed. You step back and look around the room. Light filters through the horn in a soft honeyed glow, catching in the smoke suspended beneath the rafters, turning the air into a drifting haze of gold and grey. The beams overhead seem to float in this half-light, their edges softened, their shadows long and fluid. The smoke hole above the hearth lets in a thin beam of brightness that catches the dust motes rising from the floor, and for a moment the room looks almost holy, like a tiny chapel built not of stone but of breath and warmth and waiting. A child wakes in the corner, rubbing sleepy eyes, and the small sound seems to ripple across the room like a pebble dropped in still water. She crawls closer to the fire, dragging her blanket behind her, and sits in the amber glow, her face soft with drowsiness, the cold slowly leaving her fingers. She looks toward the horn window, watching the shadows, the way the light changes as people move outside. In a world without clocks, without polished mirrors, without bright glass, this shifting blur of brightness is how you measure the day. You walk to the door and push it open slightly. A thin slice of freezing air sneaks in, and the snow outside glows with the faintest blue tint, the sky above heavy and low. The contrast between outside and inside is almost startling. The sharp, biting air of the open world versus the thick, smoky, slow warmth of the cottage. The door swings shut again, groaning softly, and you turn once more to the window. If you look at an angle, you can almost see through the horn, the vague suggestion of the village green, the shadows of people moving about in heavy cloaks, the white drift of snow shaken loose from a roof. But everything is softened, everything blurred, everything dreamlike. Medieval England is not a world of sharp edges. It is a world of glow and gloom, where vision blends with imagination. You place a heavy cloth over the window frame, a common habit in the coldest months, and instantly the room dims, becoming gentler, quieter, more sheltered. The horn keeps the wind out, the cloth keeps the warmth in, one protecting from without, the other from within, a small but important balance. As you step back toward the hearth, the fire greets your return with a low, crackling sigh, and the shadows dance across the walls again, long and soft, the room breathing in rhythm with the flame. You feel the warmth on your face, smell the faint sweetness of the rushes underfoot, hear the muffled world outside, all softened by horn and cloth, and the fragile architecture of survival. And in this dim glow, this delicate winter light filtered through the skin of an animal long gone, you realize that medieval homes were not dark because people feared brightness. They were dim because dimness held warmth, dimness held comfort, dimness held the illusion that the cold world could be kept at bay. Here, behind horn and clay and old woven cloth, the winter feels far away, even when it presses against the walls with all its weight. The morning air inside the cottage is thick enough to feel almost solid, a heavy mixture of smoke, damp wool, peat, and old straw drifting together like layers of memory. And as you take your first breath after waking, you realize that medieval winter did not simply bite the skin. It lived in the nose, the clothes, the floors, and every corner of the home. It is a scent both intimate and overwhelming, the perfume of a life pressed close to fire and earth. You push yourself upright, the straw rustling beneath you, and for a moment you simply sit there, absorbing the warmth left in the air from the night before. The fire has sunk into a bed of glowing red embers, barely stirring, but the cottage still feels alive with heat that has seeped into the walls, the floor, even the rushes scattered beneath your feet. The smell is the first thing you truly notice. The unmistakable ancient smell of winter survival. A curl of smoke rises from the hearth, moving slowly through the dim air before slipping toward the roof hole, leaving faint streaks of soot on the beams. Your eyes sting slightly, but there is comfort in it. A strange reassurance. Smoke means fire. Fire means life. Household records from centuries past describe this scent with surprising fondness. Peat smoke, rich and earthy, the soft sourness of tallow candles, the tang of drying wool, and underneath it all the faint sweetness of herbs crushed underfoot. To a medieval villager, this was not an unpleasant smell. This was home. You shift your weight and the rushes crackle lightly beneath you. They were replaced just days ago, and you can still smell the faint perfume of dried lavender and wild mint mixed into them. A quiet, humble luxury. These herbs weren't added for beauty alone. Their oils cut through the odors of animals, cooking, and damp soil. Each step releases a tiny breath of summer into the winter air. From the ceiling hangs the thick smell of smoke, of course, but it is layered with other aromas. Hot iron from last night's tools, the animal warmth radiating from the goats penned in the corner, and the lingering fragrance of pottage simmered over the fire. Barley, onion, herbs, perhaps a scrap of meat if fortune was kind. You inhale again, and the scent wraps around you like a cloak. To modern senses it might seem harsh, but here, in this time, it feels alive. Heavy, imperfect, earthy, but full of meaning. A curious custom, mentioned in household accounts from the 14th century, tells of burning dried fruit peels, oranges, apples, even pears on the hearth to sweeten the air. The peels hiss and curl when tossed onto glowing coals, releasing a brief burst of fragrant steam. You see a small pile of dried apple skins by the fire now, waiting to be used. An ordinary family would have saved these precious scraps for weeks, eating every bit of the fruit before letting the peel take its second life as aroma. The smell of tallow candles mingles with everything else. Heavy, slightly rancid, but warm. Only the wealthy burned beeswax, filling their halls with sweetness. Here the sour, smoky tallow scent is simply part of the landscape. It has soaked into the walls, the beams, the people's hair and clothes. Somewhere behind you a chicken stirs, feathers rustling, adding the faint, dusty smell of birds to the mixture. The pig shifts in its straw bed, radiating heat like a living furnace. The cottage is crowded with life, and every breath reminds you of it. Still, there is something tender in these scents, something that speaks of routine, of endurance, of small comforts made meaningful by necessity. The mother of the family rises and moves toward the hearth, stirring the embers with practiced care. The smell of the fire strengthens instantly, sharp, woody, and promising. She sprinkles a handful of barley into the pot, and the steam that rises carries the clean, honest smell of simple food being coaxed into existence. Her movement stirs the air, and for a moment you catch a blend of smells so layered. They seem to paint a picture of life itself. The peat glowing in the hearth, the damp wool of last night's sit's cloaks, the faint herbal sweetness beneath your feet, the comforting animal heat of the beasts nearby, and above all, the heavy, smoky breath of the cottage, the smell of survival. It is not pleasant, not luxurious, not delicate, but it is the smell that meant you lived another night. When you step outside for a moment, the world feels shockingly clean by comparison, the cold air stabbing your lungs with purity, with sharpness, with silence. But after only a breath or two, you find yourself stepping back into the smoky warmth, into the crowded, fragrant air of the cottage, because out there is winter, and in here is life. And as the fire crackles and the steam rises from the pot, you realize that this scent, this thick, layered, powerful scent, is not a burden but a companion. a reminder that warmth must be earned, that comfort comes from effort, and that even in the harshest winter, a home has a heartbeat you can smell. The wind shifts sometime after dawn, not violently, not with the roar of a storm, but with a slow, deliberate sigh that pushes its way through the village, curling around doors and slipping beneath rooflines like a living creature, searching for any crack it can find. You hear it before you feel it, the faint hiss of air sneaking through the tiniest gap in the wall, the soft rattle of thatch settling overhead, the rustling of straw as the animals stir in their corner. When you open your eyes, the cottage feels different, not colder, exactly, but alert, awake, listening. You pull your blanket tighter and stand, your breath drifting into the air as a thin white mist. The fire has burned down to embers again, glowing like sleepy red pearls beneath their grey covering of ash. Even so, the warmth they release is steady, enough to take the sharpest edge off the morning frost. Beside you, the animals shift. The pig exhales a deep, warm snort. The goat stretches stiff legs. A chicken hops once and settles again, its feathers puffed like a small living hearth. Their presence fills the cottage with a quiet, breathing heat, a communal warmth that was never accidental but essential. Medieval winter was not survived alone. As you move toward the wall, you run your fingers along the rough surface of mud and straw. It feels cold on the surface, but beneath, the material holds a faint warmth, as if it remembers every fire that ever burned inside the room. You press lightly, feeling the give of the door between the wooden ribs beneath it. Not rigid, not lifeless, but flexible, breathing. That is the first secret of medieval shelter. A house that bends survives. Archaeologists have long noted that these wattle and daub walls didn't resist the wind, they worked with it. When a storm struck, the walls swayed just enough to stay whole. Rigid stone might crack, thick oak might split, but mud and woven hazel, they ride the storm like reeds by a riverbank. You trace the lines of the wall upward, noticing small bunches of moss pressed into tiny cracks. Some villagers used sheep's wool instead. Others packed gaps with straw dipped in animal fat, which hardened as it dried and sealed out the worst of the cold. You touch a bit of moss now, soft, springy, faintly damp, smelling of earth and forest even in the dead of winter. Such small, almost invisible acts of care were the difference between shivering and sleeping. You turn toward the doorway, where a thick piece of woven cloth hangs like a curtain. It sways gently with the wind outside, stirring slightly with each gust. In the night it acted as a barrier, a shield of fabric that kept the warmth inside. It is rough, patched and worn, but it hangs proudly, doing the job that no wooden door alone could ever manage. A curious detail mentioned in old household notes describes how villagers layered these cloths during the cold months, one inside the house, one outside, with a pocket of trapped air between them that acted as makeshift insulation. Ingenious in its simplicity, and surprisingly effective. You step toward the hearth, stirring the embers with a stick until the glow brightens, then adding a few twigs and a larger log. The flame catches slowly, almost reluctantly, sighing upward in thin orange waves. The smell rises too, smoke, tar, resin, the deep earthy scent of peat, all mingling in a warm, heavy perfume that fills the room with life. The goats move closer to the fire, their hooves clicking softly on the straw-covered floor. The warmth of animals was a kind of architecture too, an arrangement of bodies and breath that made space livable. A medieval home was not divided into human and animal rooms, but woven together into a single ecosystem of warmth, work, sound, and survival. You kneel near the fire, letting the heat roll across your cheeks. Above you, the rafters are wrapped in scraps of old linen, a trick used to catch the condensation that formed when smoke met cold wood. Without those scraps, droplets of icy water would fall steadily onto the people sleeping below, each drop a small but miserable reminder of the winter pressing in from outside. It is still early, but the cottage hums with quiet movement. Someone at the far end of the room coughs softly beneath a blanket. A pot rattles as last night's stew thickens over the rekindled flame. The animals breathe slow clouds of warmth into the air. And yet, even with all this, winter still tries to step through the walls. You notice it in the thin crack beneath one of the beams, a faint shimmer of frost creeping through where the moss has shrunk slightly in the night. You press a bit of straw into the gap, and already the draft softens. This constant adjusting, repairing, and noticing was simply part of life. Survival was an ongoing conversation between people and walls, a quiet negotiation between structure and season. Some medieval builders went further still. Records described families draping spare cloaks or even old sacks along the inside walls during the deepest cold, creating soft barriers that trapped heat. In monasteries, monks hung curtains around their beds, turning their sleeping spaces into smaller, warmer pockets, little tents of cloth within vast icy halls. You can feel the truth of this now. The cottage holds its warmth not because of a single brilliant invention, but because of hundreds of small decisions passed through generations, refined by experience and born from necessity. When you step closer to the door, you notice something else. The faintest warmth in the air, drifting from the neighbouring cottage through the shared wall. Medieval villages were built close, intentionally close, with houses leaning toward one another, like weary travellers supporting each other in a storm. The warmth of one home helped warm the next. The walls might whisper each other's secrets, carry the sound of laughter or a baby's cry, but they also carried heat, the most precious resource of winter. You push aside the cloth curtain over the doorway, and the cold rushes in like a wave. The world outside is white and silent, every roof dusted in frost that sparkles in the pale sun. But inside, behind you, the cottage breathes, warm, smoky, dim, alive. You step back in and close the curtain. The wind's howl softens, the warmth settles, the animals sigh, the house exhales. And so do you. Because in medieval England, a home was not just built, it lived. It held warmth the way a body holds breath. And in the heart of winter, that breath is everything.